There's a question that is repeatedly posed by traditionally minded Catholics, and it's whether Pope Leo XIV will undo Traditionis Custodes and restore access to the traditional Latin Mass as it was under Benedict XVI. Others ask whether he'll find some middle ground between the positions of Benedict and Francis. And then again, there are those who, for some reason, think that Pope Leo is the great restorationist pope of Catholic prophecy. And they will ask when he will undo Vatican II and restore the traditional Latin Mass as the main rite of Mass in the Latin West. That last position is extremely unlikely to happen, but there are those asking whether Leo will in some way restore the traditional Latin Mass. So let's examine the question because it's not cut and dry like many are hoping. And this is one of those issues where the people who knew Robert Prevost before he became Pope Leo XIV find this entire question funny because they know him and say that it's not going to happen. We'll see. Leo speaks eloquently about unity in the church, and the question of unity is central to the traditional Latin Mass controversy. Critics of traditionalists say that TLM is divisive and that it fuels quasi-schismatic tendencies. Others, like I just saw in my live chat before this live stream started, say that it was the new Mass that causes quasi-schismatic tendencies and is divisive. You see how this happens. Others say that there is a need for singular, unified worship in the Latin West. And people tend to respond to all of this by saying that in the new Mass, in the Mass most people attend on Sundays, there is no unified worship due to liturgical abuse being the rule of the day. Few priests who offer the regular Novus Ordo Mass follow the general instruction of the Roman Missal to the letter, even at your reverent appearing Novus Ordo Masses. So the criticism of the TLM as divisive and schismatic tends to ring hollow. Some have said that the targeting of the TLM for banishment is a form of persecution. And I'm going to show you a clip of somebody with a lot more credibility than I do on this issue, telling you just that. Here is Bishop Athanasius Schneider in the interview Joe McLean did on his show. The clip is reposted here on X by Michael Haynes. I will have a link to the full interview that Joe McLean did on his YouTube channel at returntotradition.org not long after the live stream is over. But here is Bishop Schneider on the persecution of traditional Catholics.
I would invite especially those bishops who are unfortunately persecuting those Catholics who love this traditional liturgy, who are marginalizing them under the. Even if so, these same bishops, they appeal to synodality, to listening to others, to be inclusive. But only one category is persecuted in our day in the church. These are the Catholics, young people, families, children, who love the Mass of their ancestors, who love the Mass of the saints only for this one reason. They are humiliated. They are excluded. This is an injustice. We must state this. We must say this in all our concern. This must be healed. And I appeal to Pope Leo, please heal these wounds. Please come to help to your children who are persecuted, who are humiliated by so many bishops. Please help them and reintegrate them, give them the freedom only to worship as was always worshipped the Lord through the traditional liturgy.
The interview that Joe McLean is very good and worth your time to watch. Again, link will be in the show notes at returntotradition.org. Now, the lack of unity in worship, especially in the new Mass communities, meaning in your 99% of Latin Rite parishes, is a sign of decadence, according to Cardinal Burke. And Cardinal Burke said this at a rather major conference on the Latin Mass. We'll just go here to what he has to say. The headline is Cardinal Burke, Doctrinal and Moral Corruption Directly Related to Abuse of the Liturgy. Recalling the warnings of popes and saints, Cardinal Burke said neglect of liturgical law and tradition has paved the way for widespread confusion about faith and morals. And this is a problem at virtually every, 99% of parishes in the United States and well beyond. When we look at the data is pretty clear. Only 13% of Catholics go to Mass on a semi-regular basis, and then the ones who do, most of them don't believe what the church teaches on moral issues. There's a rather gigantic crisis in the church, and a lot has to do with the chaos involving the liturgy itself. So we'll just go here and see what Cardinal Burke has to say according to the National Catholic Register. I looked up his speech, and it's over an hour long, so I'm not playing it for you here. Quote, Cardinal Raymond Burke has appealed to Pope Leo XIV to lift the restrictions on the pre-1970 liturgy, stressing that respect for liturgical tradition is critical for the Catholic Church's mission, and that doctrinal and moral corruption shows itself in divisions and factions that lead to liturgical abuse. Speaking via a video linked to London conference celebrating 60 years of the Latin Mass Society of England and Wales, Cardinal Burke recalled that the most serious difficulty St. Paul faced in the early church in Corinth was the abuse that had entered into the celebration of the Most Holy Eucharist, and that it was directly related to doctrinal and moral divisions among members of the community. Church history, he said, shows that doctrinal and moral corruption in the church is manifested in the falsification of divine worship, adding that where the truth of doctrine and the goodness of morals are not respected, neither is the beauty of worship. The solution, he said, is a renewed respect for tradition and the laws governing the sacred liturgy. The American cardinal also told the conference that he had already asked Pope Leo XIV to remove restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass as soon as it is reasonably possible, in the hope that the situation would be restored to how it was during Benedict XVI's pontificate. Early in the talk, Cardinal Burke quoted the 5th century church father Prosper of Aquitaine, who said, "The law of praying postulates the law of believing." The cardinal added that the sacred liturgy is the highest expression of life in Christ, and therefore true worship cannot but reflect true faith. The sacred liturgy is the church's greatest treasure and irreplaceable, and he continued saying that the disorder and corruption within the faith and its practice will not be able to stand in the face of the truth, beauty, and goodness contained in the worship of God in spirit and truth. Furthermore, he stressed that divine worship has been established not by man, but by our Lord himself, and so fidelity to tradition, how it has been handed down since the time of the apostles, is paramount. Respect for tradition is nothing less than respect for the ius divinum of divine right, he said, and essential for the right and just relationship between God and his creation, especially man created in the image and likeness of God. But he noted an exaggerated focus on the human aspect of the sacred liturgy in the post-conciliar, meaning current period of the past 60 years, which he said leads to a diminished emphasis on encountering God through sacramental signs and to a neglect of man's right relationship with God. The cardinal blamed antinomianism, the belief that there is no obligation to observe the moral law, which has spread since the 1960s and given rise to liturgical antinomianism, which he called its most hideous manifestation. He reminded the audience that the first focus of the Ten Commandments is on divine worship, and that the fundamental principle of ius divinum is God's right to receive man's worship in the way he commands. If worship offered to God in spirit and truth, which he called God's gift to man, is not honored, then God's law is corrupted for human purposes. Only by observing and honoring God's right to be known, worshipped, and served as he commands does man find his happiness. And he goes on talking about how canon law these days, having a little problems with the streaming service this morning, as you can tell, but he goes on to lament how canon law these days does not respect the rights of God. And when he talks about the man-centered focus of the Mass today, that is right out of the lips of Vatican II documents. It's right out of the lips of the biggest offenders of the new Mass, of every pope for the last 60 years, all of it. It's a very mainstream statement to say that the Mass promulgated by Paul VI in 1970 was designed to be man-centered. And he says this is essentially stripping away of the rights of God. And now, Burke has never been, as a cardinal, one who denies the validity of the new Mass and tries to argue for its abolition. He never does that, although it sounds like it there. Now, it's been widely reported that Burke as that Burke has asked Leo to restore access to the TLM. He says it in that interview. You get insight into his reasoning in that interview. But will he do it? Will Pope Leo XIV restore access to the traditional Mass to at least the level of Benedict XVI? I'm going to give you a positive sign that he will. That will instill hope in many. But I'm also going to give you testimony from someone who knows Pope Leo very well, who says that there is zero chance that it happens. Let's do with the good news first, because people tend to like good news, and it comes from Info Vaticana. Apologies in advance for their pop-up ads. Can't really do much about that. Not in a way, anyway, that conforms to the rules of YouTube. So, the headline is Leo XIV to Burke and Memberti. Help me restore law. That's interesting. Part of the issue with the traditional Mass question is one of canon law. Not only because Francis altered canon law with his elimination of the TLM, but because Francis frequently ignored canon law altogether, including its suppression of religious orders. Francis's was a lawless pontificate which fueled division in the church. And here we have an account of Leo asking Burke to help restore the rule of law in the church. Again, I can't do much about these stupid ads. From the article, quote, "The election of a pope is not just white smoke. It is also when God so wills, the beginning of a restoration. And this began discreetly but powerfully on the very night of the conclave at the Santa Marta residence. At the end of the dinner of on that historic evening, the Pope approached two cardinals who each in their own way represent the canonical rigor and doctrinal clarity that the church urgently needs. He said to them calmly but firmly, 'Help me restore the church's right.' They were Raymond Leo Burke and Dominic Memberti. Burke, known for his tireless defense of canon law and traditional liturgy, has been marginalized during the previous pontificate. Memberti, prefect of the Apostolic Signatura, is a brilliant diplomat, a sober and prudent jurist who has avoided the limelight without renouncing the truth. It wasn't a photo, it was a request for collaboration, a clear indication of the direction the new pope wants to take, and a message to both inside and outside. The time of arbitrariness, or do whatever you want as long as you quote Francis, is over. For years, canon law has been ignored, reinterpreted, or outright trampled on by ideological commissions, makeshift secretariats, or synods of convenience. The new pope, who knows firsthand what it means to suffer episcopal shenanigans as prefect, as happened with the famous Spanish Commission on Appointments, now dissolved, knows that without law there is no justice. Without justice there is no communion. That is why he wants the church to be given back respect for its own rights, not as a bureaucratic corset, but as a guarantor of truth, order, and authentic freedom. In his first weeks as Pope, Leo XIV has preferred silence to overexposure. He celebrated Mass with sobriety, avoiding making wisecracks in interviews, and let his actions speak for themselves. One of them, perhaps the most significant so far, was that nocturnal appeal at Santa Marta, the beginning of a new style, a reform built not on slogans but on convictions. We're not facing a media revolution. There are no selfies, no random hugs, no ambiguous phrases. But there is hope, and this hope is expressed in concrete names, in institutional decisions, and in a return to ecclesiastical common sense. That is their interpretation of his exchange with Cardinal Burke, that it was a call for him to help him restore law in the church. That seems positive. Here's the pillar's take on the question, though, and you'll maybe get a different sort of feeling from the pillar, because this is a complicated question. The headline is, can Pope Leo afford to wait on Traditionis Custodes? Emerging tensions over Traditionis Custodes seem at times to be exacerbating the issues that it was meant to address. Now, again, this is a complicated issue here, but their reporting on this is good. However, the article has important parts for the discussion that we'll focus on here, because we're not going to read this whole very long article, but it's spread throughout the document. So instead, I just took the most important parts of this entire question and I put them into a Word document so you can see it. From the article, quote, "The announcements in Detroit and Charlotte highlight the ongoing controversy over the implementation of Traditionis Custodes nearly 4 years after its promulgation, and the mounting hopes among TLM communities that Pope Leo XIV may revisit its provisions. But while expectations of a papal intervention mount, the Pope himself has not given any public indication of any plans he may have to revisit the issue, or in what time frame he might choose to do so. In the meantime, the ongoing implementation of Traditionis Custodes continues to generate pushback in some dioceses. It may even be creating and exacerbating some of the pastoral challenges it was meant to address. So what options does Leo have in considering the issue? How urgently might he need to act? And so then the article goes on to give you a lot of details about Charlotte and Detroit. And if you've been following those stories at all, you already know. And then it goes on to say, and it is clear that the matter has been brought to Leo's attention. In a video circulated online, Cardinal Burke related to the Latin Mass Society's 60th anniversary conference, they had raised the subject with the new Pope. But although Cardinal Burke expressed his hope that Leo will, as soon as it's possible, take up the study of this question and try to restore the situation as it was after Summorum Pontificum, he gave no indication of how the Pope received his request. While many have insisted that local bishops halt implementation of Traditionis Custodes until Leo makes his mind known, absent some indication of a papal intention to act immediately, waiting for Leo could prove an indefinite endeavor. It's worth recalling that despite expectations of imminent papal action, Francis waited some 8 years into his own pontificate to reverse Benedict XVI's provisions in Summorum Pontificum, effectively granting universal license to celebrate the extraordinary form. Nevertheless, part of the expectation on local bishops now to cease implementing papal law following a change of pope is itself a legacy of the Francis era. Under Pope Francis, many canonists, curial officials, and diocesan chanceries felt that the rule of law in the church had become dependent directly on active papal will to enforce it across a range of issues: liturgical, penal, procedural, and administrative. As such, while Traditionis Custodes remains the operative law of the church, many now feel a similar standard of personal endorsement should be expected of Leo prior to bishops making any changes which could be disruptive to the lives of local communities. Of course, in much the same way as bishops sympathetic to the traditional Mass continue to rely upon and govern under the norms of Summorum Pontificum for many years under Pope Francis, others now will feel equally justified in asserting that silence from the new Pope presumes his endorsement of the current law. Leo himself might reasonably wish to wait for a few months, if not years, to firmly grasp the ecclesiastical third rail which the TLM has become in the life of the church, taking time first to establish the general tone of his pontificate and deal with his own priorities. But the emerging tension of the full implementation of Traditionis Custodes is only likely to increase, especially if it seems likely it becomes visibly asymmetrical across dioceses. More to the point, absent a clear and coherent papal vision for Traditionis Custodes, the motu proprio could end up creating and exacerbating some of the problems it supposedly is meant to address. In other words, it could help fuel schismatic tendencies in the church, according to some. I don't think it fuels schismatic tendencies. I think clown masses at all too many normal, ordinary form parishes fuel this. That the priests ad-libbing sometimes, the consecration fuels this problem, not so much the traditional Mass. The article had the important parts for you, but it all begs a question. Will Leo restore the TLM? Now, I've cited this article here, even yesterday, from katholisch.de, and it's something to be reminding ourselves of. Katholisch.de is the German bishop's official news site, and they had an interview here with an Augustinian prior who says that Leo is not a revolutionary. And it's considered generally unusual for a pope to undo the acts of his predecessors. Here's as a refresher, here's what the Augustinian prior has to say. Do you think Leo is a revolutionary? To which he responds, no, he's not a revolutionary. He treats people well. He speaks kindly to everyone. He's diplomatic. That's how I experienced him as a cardinal of the Curia. When he visited our convent in Vienna last November, after the services, the people were so pleased that he'd taken the time for them. He didn't leave. He stayed, listened, and sought out conversations. He was always with the people and still enjoys it. That's how I experienced it. I noticed that during his first speech in the loggia, he was moved by the people and almost cried. I think he sensed that people were happy that he was here. And the way he's going to do it, it will be good. He will do his utmost and tackle the issues that are now relevant. He's not someone who sweeps things under the rug or hides them under the carpet. And the question is, does Leo think the Latin Mass question is even relevant? Popes almost never undo the work of their predecessors. This is again a question of unity or continuity. It is the rule for popes, not contradicting their predecessors directly on the decisions they've made, but continuing the work they've done. That is one reason Francis's pontificate was lawless. He undid the work of Benedict XVI and John Paul II on actually a few issues, but most especially on the TLM. And this point is underscored here in an interview with Dom Radio that Gloria TV summarizes for us, and this is one that will not make people very happy. So we go here to Gloria TV, the headline, best friend of Leo XIV, no chance he brings back the Roman Rite. Gloria TV's EN News service always calls the traditional Mass the Roman Rite because they don't generally accept the validity of the TLM or the new Mass. And by validity, I don't think they actually make the case that it doesn't give you the Eucharist. There seems to be more of a validity in terms of law question. Now, I did check the Dom Radio quote, and I'll give you the full one from Dom Radio itself in just a moment for those who don't trust Gloria TV. But here is the summary of the question. Quote, Cardinal Robert Prevost knew he might be elected Pope. Father Alejandro Morel, prior general of the Augustinians, told Dom Radio on 17th of June. Roberto was mentioned in some newspapers as one of several possible candidates. Judging by his abilities, he had a good chance of becoming Pope. I've also spoken to him about it. Father Morel is a very good friend of Pope Leo XIV. Some even say his closest friend. They have known each other since 1981, when the two Augustinians studied together in Rome. Asked whether Pope Leo XIV would take a different approach to the Mass and the Roman Rite than Pope Francis, Father Morel replied, I think it is excluded that this topic will resurface under the Leo XIV. Father Morel supports the suppression of the traditional Mass. As members of the Church, we must all do our part to ensure that we remain in communion. This also applies to groups that promote the Old Mass. He describes Leo XIV as a pleasant, simple, calm, and level-headed man. When we presided at the Eucharist, he often played the organ. He's very good at it. He's also a good singer. We often went for walks together, too. He is simply a very normal person. Pope Francis very much appreciated Cardinal Prevost, Father Morel recalled. He really liked him. He told me that several times. He didn't appoint him bishop, prefect of the Congregation for Bishops and Cardinal, for no reason. Father Morel seriously believes that Francis was a saint, and he is upset by the way he has been spoken of since he passed away. That's someone who knows him, who's known him for years, 45 years, saying that there's almost no chance that he's going to bring it back. Now, I will go here just for the sake of reassuring people that this is from the Dom Radio interview all that's taken from. domradio.de, a German outlet. Just go all the way down here to the Latin Mass section, which is buried. They bury the lead here. They say there are groups within the Church who hope that Pope Leo will take a different approach to the so-called Old Mass than his predecessor, who was very restrictive on this issue. You hope this will lead to greater unity within the Church. How do you assess the Pope in this regard? Father Morel says, I consider it out of the question that this issue will come up again under Leo XIV. That wouldn't make sense either because the Church reformed itself at the Second Vatican Council, including its liturgy. As members of the Church, we must all do our part to remain in communion. This also applies to these groups that promote the Old Mass. End quote. Now, of course, Father Morel gets one thing wrong. If you read the documents of Vatican II on the liturgy, they didn't call for a new Mass. They called for the traditional Mass, as we call it today, to be the normative Mass. What they called for was a few parts of the Mass to be changed from Latin into the local language. A few parts, but most of the Mass to be still be said in Latin, with the priest facing liturgical east, meaning he has his back to you, and altar rails and communion on the tongue and all of that. And if that is what we had gotten after Vatican II, I don't think the SSPX would exist today. I don't think most of your traditionalist orders would exist today. And you wouldn't have this division over the liturgy in the Church. But instead, revolutionary men took a document that is in some parts very clear and others not so clear and used it to promote revolution. Damon Keller says Schneider is pro-SSPX, but Burke is not. Leo listens to who? Right, that is another question, but we'll see. We'll see if he normalizes the SSPX, because the SSPX have been wanting to be normalized. They exist in a canonical limbo right now. They're not out of communion. There is no partial communion. They are in communion. Benedict said as much. Schneider, working on behalf of Pope Francis, said as much. But they have no canonical status because they've just been stuck in limbo over an argument about Vatican II and other things that they need to work out. But I'm just going to tell you that there is a lot of people who believe that Leo will restore things. And maybe he will. Maybe. But those who know him say repeatedly that he will not. What do you think is the likelihood of this? Let me know in the comments, please. Hey, like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps too. The sources for this, all of it will be at returntotradition.org. YouTube has rules about posting links to places with ads on them, so I follow those rules. Hence why I post them on my own ad-free website. I'm also thinking about expanding my ad-free website and having a second one that is on Substack for those of you who are regular Substack readers. Let me know if you would be interested in that in the comments. It would not take long for me to do that. And always pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.